Hi, today we'll go over a utility called Javadoc that's used for documentation in Java programs. Documentation is an important part of producing quality software. It helps keep your code readable when testing is being done, and if one is trying to debug and find an issue, any kind of additional documentation information would help debug and find the issue. It's also very important for maintainability of the software, so that later on when teams change and if there's some other developers working on the project, they're still able to make sense out of the code and continue making enhancements to it. So we'll look at this utility, and it's a very simple tool, and it's an easy way to generate HTML documentation. It's also useful in providing a snapshot of an API of a, say you create a class to be added to a library for others to use. It provides a complete snapshot of what is the purpose of the class without revealing any of the internal details of the class. It's really providing a description of the interface of what are the data members of the class and what's the behavior or the methods of the class. And in this case, we are mainly interested in the public methods that one could use. So let's get started and take a look at the basic commands first, and then I'll show you a few examples. So as you know, typically we use the two forward slashes or the slash star and then ending star slash for comment blocks. That's our typical comment blocks in Java. With Javadoc, it's slightly different. You basically use a forward slash followed by two stars to open a Javadoc block, and then you provide all of your comments or a description of the class or the method that you're describing, and then when you want to end the block, you end it with a star followed by the forward slash. So really that's the big difference, and from the regular comments. If you're using IDE like Eclipse, it will also provide some highlighting and differentiate the Javadoc comments from the regular comments. So typically the Javadoc comments are highlighted in blue by default, and then the regular comments are highlighted in green, so you can easily differentiate which parts are going to go into the Javadoc documentation. So the goal is, as a programmer, as you're writing your class, you also provide these additional comments, and then later on we can use the Javadoc utility and then generate an HTML document out of it. So here's a simple example of a class called my class. So the guideline is always provide a Javadoc block above before you start defining your class, describing the purpose of the class, and that's what you see over here. And it can run into multiple lines. That's no problem if you want to break up the description into multiple lines, and I'll show you an example of that as well. So here you first specify what the purpose of my class is, then provide the definition of my class itself. The next thing that you can do is provide description of all the data members of your class. So in this case, we have an integer data field called myInt field. So we specify a Javadoc description above it, specifying the purpose of that field. Next, you specify, in a similar manner, you specify descriptions of all of the methods. So here we have a constructor for my class. So you can specify a description of the constructor and what arguments it takes and what kind of fields it sets. So that's the basics, and there's a lot more that you can add to it, but to start out with, that's how you can add Javadoc comment blocks. Next, we'll look at some Javadoc tags there are some predefined tags or keywords that are recognized by this utility, and when you provide them, it knows that it's a specific type of information, and it will provide a corresponding formatting for it. So some of the common predefined tags are, and you should typically include all of these in your code. The first one is, so all of these predefined tags, they start with the symbol, with the @ symbol, as you can see here. So you want to specify specify author information. So you would say at author and then specify the name of the author. If you want to specify multiple authors, then on the next line you can have another at author and specify the name of the author. The next useful thing is version. So you want to specify the version of the class or the interface. So when you start out, say it's version 1.0, and then if you make enhancements to it, it's version 1.1 or 2.0, depending on however you want to do the numbering. So add version and then indicate the version number. When you're describing methods or constructors, it's useful to have to describe all of the parameters. What are the parameters that go into the method as input or into the constructor? So at param is the predefined tag to specify the arguments. So you say at param and specify the name of the parameter or the argument, and then provide a description of the argument. And then if there is a return type, now this doesn't apply to constructors and void methods, but if there is a method that returns something, then it's useful to specify at return and provide a description of what is it that's returned. So say for example, if you're writing a method that computes standard deviation, then the value that's returned is the standard deviation of the array of integers that's passed to the method. So something like that. You describe what is it that the result and the description of the result that's returned. A few other predefined tags. If your method throws exceptions, then you use the predefined tag exception and list all the exceptions that are thrown. So you first list the name of the exception and a brief description of that exception. Now another alternative to this is throws. You can also use the at throws tag and then list all the exceptions that are thrown by that method that it has already declared that it can throw. So let's look at another example here now with all of these tags that we just looked at. So here's the same my class example. Here's our Javadoc block. So you can start out with a few sentences describing the purpose of the class, followed by the author information. So in this case we have two authors, so there are two author predefined tags, followed by a version. So we and the version, whatever versioning scheme you're using, based on that you specify the version number, and then you can also specify a date over there. And there are a number of other additional tags. These are the commonly used ones and the ones that you should be using in your project and assignments for this course are what I'm showing here. But then towards the end of this document, I have a few links that will take you to the full documentation, and it will provide the full list of the tags that are available. So as you can see in this block, like I said, it can span into multiple lines. That's no problem. Each line should be prefixed with a star because it's a comment block. And then you have the class definitions. So we have a description of the data member, and next we're going to describe the methods. So our first one is the constructor, and this constructor throws an exception. So here's a description of the constructor. Now we skipped the at param predefined tag in this case because the constructor does not take in any parameters here in this case. It's a default no argument constructor. Also it's a constructor, so it doesn't return any, it doesn't explicitly return a value, it's just creating the object, so we don't have to describe the return type as well. But then we're describing throws because we know that it throws my exception, and then you can provide a description of what my exception is. Next, we'll look at a method. There is a method called myMethod in this class. It returns an object. It takes in two arguments. The first one is an integer and the second one is a string. So here's the Javadoc block describing the method. So there's a brief description, a few sentences about the method itself and its purpose. Then we are specifying the parameters. So we have at param a. And provide a description of A. Then we have the second parameter B and provide a description of B, and then it has a return type and provide a description of what is returned, the result that's returned. So that's basically the idea of Javadoc. So you specify these kind of descriptions for all of your important public methods. You can specify it for private methods as well. When you compile and create the documentation, there is an option to hide or show private methods. Typically, you would hide the private methods because when you're exposing your or providing information about the class interface, we want to only provide that information about the public members and public methods, because that's what a user of the class should be interested in. The next thing is about compilation. So once you've written all of these comments in your code, how do you generate the HTML documentation? So there's two ways in which you can do it. You can do it from command prompt using the Javadoc command, just like you use Javac to compile a Java program and Java to run a class file. Similarly, Javadoc will generate the documentation. So the simplest form would be basically say Javadoc and then space, provide the file names, the source, and you can have multiple file names. You can just space separate them, all of your .java files that you want where there is Javadoc comments and you want them compiled into HTML file. You would provide that list. Now there are also some additional options that you can provide. So these are optional. So if you want to specify them, then you would use the command Javadoc followed by the options followed by the file names. So for example, if you can include or exclude certain sections in the HTML document. So say there is the author predefined tag, then it's when you generate the documentation, it's up to you whether you want to show the author section or not. So using the -author option will include the author section. Similarly, using the private option will include all the private methods. Otherwise, by default, it's only the public and the protected ones that are shown. And then you can include a class path if you want to, if there is a need to search for referenced class files, or a class path list. Similarly, you can specify a source path if you want to search for all the Java files at a particular location and then generate documentation for them. Version, you can again either include the version information in the documentation or not. So using the version option will include it. By default, it's not. So now this is when you run the command from the command line. It can also be, you can generate this documentation from the IDE, and it's much easier to do that. If you were to do it through Eclipse, you would just go to the file and there's an export option, and then you basically select whichever file, Java file it is, you select that file, and on it you use the export option, and then you can generate the HTML documentation. So before it generates the documentation, it will show you a form with all of these different options. Do you want to include the private methods and variables? Do you want to include author section? Do you want to include version section? So it will give you those options using a user interface, and it's you just select them on the form. And then you can also specify the location of where you want the generated documentation to be saved. So you can specify that location, and then the documentation gets stored over there. There is a way to specify that location in using Javadoc as well, from command prompt as well. So here's an example of when you do it from command line. So say at command line, you would say Javadoc space a.java, b.java. So you're saying compile the Java files A and B, and then some other ones as well that are at inside the folder other work, and you're just saying get all Java files from there. So what this will do is it'll compile the documentation for A, for B, and for all Java files that are inside the folder other work. Now a few more complex ones with different options. So here's one wherein we are saying we want to do the Javadoc compilation. You want to include version section. You want to include all the private members and data. The D is basically where you want your documentation to be saved. So you're specifying the path. You want it saved under my doc -source path list, and then you're specifying all of your source, basically all of your source files, and if you have a class path, if there are some referenced libraries, then you can specify the class path as well. So that's a more complex one, wherein you want to use a number of different options of Javadoc. But if you were to do it from Eclipse, it's much easier. You basically use the file export option and then say export as Javadoc. You'll have to, the first time you do it, you'll have to enter the path for javadoc.exe, and it would typically be in the inside the bin folder of the SDK, wherever your SDK is installed. So you would point to that and then say next, and then it'll take you to the generate Javadoc window. So that's where it'll show the different options, the different visibility options, and you can select a path for the destination folder, and then you click on finish. So it'll generate the documentation. All of the documentation will be found at that destination folder that you selected. Now it will be HTML files. So there will be an index.html, and that's the one that you'll have to open up to see the documentation. But then along with it, there will be a number of other subfolders and supporting files. You will need all of them for that index.html to render properly and for the formatting to look right. So that's about using it from Eclipse. Also, another thing in Eclipse is the nice thing is, because it's an IDE with a lot of intelligent features, it makes it easy for you to include some of the code and comments. So anywhere in your edit window where you're editing your code, you can right click and then click on source and say add Javadoc comment. So what Eclipse will do is, depending on the location of where you are, so say you're in a method, then it'll add a Javadoc comment block above the method. It'll add a blank stub so that you can go in and fill in the different details. So depending on the location of where your cursor is, it'll automatically add those Javadoc blocks for you. But then you still have to go in and fill in the details of the description and all of the different predefined tags. It might provide some predefined tags for you, but then you'll have to fill in the details. So that's how you can do it from Eclipse. It's fairly straightforward. It's the main thing is remembering at least these basic predefined tags, and then you can look up these links for further details. Like there's a tag called @c if you want to refer to other related libraries, or if it's being extended from parent class, then you can provide the name of the parent class, so that if one is interested in looking at the documentation of that parent class, then they can click on that and take a look at it. But let me quickly show you how the documentation would look. So basically the generated documentation, the way it's going to look is, if you have looked up the on Google, if you've ever searched for a description of a particular Java class, like if you look for string class, it'll take you to the documentation on docs.oracle.com, where all of the all the classes that are described in the Java library, all of them are listed in there, and you can look up a description of each and every class that's in the library. So the way that documentation is shown, that's Javadoc documentation. So here's the here's how it looks for class string. So basically at the top, if there's packaging information, it'll show that, followed by the name of the class, and then all of this is the description that was provided in the Javadoc block. Depending on how much description you provide, all of that is displayed. Then there's these different sections depending on the tags that you specified. Like there's the C also, that's provided by the @c predefined tag. There's an @since predefined tag. All of the data fields that are in your class, they are listed in a table. The public data fields, they're listed in a table along with their type, and then the name of the field and a description. So this is the description that you specify on top of the field. So that's what gets displayed here. All the constructors, they are formatted into a separate table. So when there are multiple, string has a lot of overloaded constructors. That's why there's so many. Basically all the constructors with their description will get displayed. Now if you click on any one of them, it takes you to the detail about that particular method or constructor, and it shows the description. Here's the description. Here are all the parameters, the parameter names followed by their descriptions. If it throws an exception, then it provides information about that exception. So here's the name of the exception followed by the description that you provided in the class, and so on. If there is a return type, then it will provide information about the return type. So let's look at methods. So here is the method summary, all of the methods. Here's the return type, and then the method name itself along with its argument list and a description. So in this summary table, it's only showing the brief description, but then when you click on the method, that's where it takes you into the details and provides all of the details, the parameters, what it returns, what it throws, all of that information is shown over there. Now let me show you another example. Now here's an example of a method called getImage. So it's a public method. So I'm sorry, I was showing you the documentation. Let me show you the I want to first show you how the Javadoc comments are written. Here it is. So here's the Javadoc comments for it. So the method itself is over here, but above it you see all of the documentation. The first few sentences describing the purpose of the method, and then you can see that inside that description you can because ultimately the documentation that's generated is HTML, so you can specify any HTML tags in it, and they will get rendered appropriately when it's rendered in the browser. So here we're using a paragraph tag, we're using the link to specify links, so you can use any of the other HTML tags in here to provide additional formatting for the description. Then we're specifying here the two parameters, URL and name are listed and their descriptions are provided, and then there's the @return predefined tag and its description, and then there's also the @c, and it says you can look at the image class, so it's kind of providing information about some other related classes. And then the method itself is over here, the getImage method. And then the corresponding HTML documentation generated is what it looks like this. And I showed you an example of a string, so it's basically the same format. Now if you want to look at a few more examples, now the Oracle pages have a lot of examples that you can look at. Here's an example for a class, for the graphics class. So as you can see, there's this whole big description about the purpose of this class, and you can also see that within the description a lot of HTML tags have been used. Then we specify the two authors, the version, and then the since which version has this been available, and then the actual class definition begins. Then the next block here is describing the draw image method. So there's a draw image method. Again, there's a description, a few sentences describing the purpose of the method, and then all the parameters, the four parameters are listed with their descriptions, followed by what is returned. In this case, what is returned is the image. It's complete if it is completely loaded and painted successfully. Then true value is returned, otherwise a false value is returned. So it's basically a Boolean. This method returns a Boolean value. So it's returning a success or a true or a false depending on successful painting of the image or not. And then there is @c, so it's basically referring to two other related classes, image and image observer, and then there's also a since attribute. So this is how you can provide Javadoc comments in your code. It's fairly straightforward. So in this course, for all of the assignments and the projects, any coding assignments that you would be doing, you should provide this kind of Javadoc comments. And in some cases where it's specified, you have to compile the HTML documentation and submit the HTML documentation as well. That's all in this tutorial. Thank you.